Week 7 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few wide receivers I looked at off the wire this week. The first receiver, Josh Downs of the Indianapolis Colts. Josh Downs, since Joe Flacco's been inserted to the starting lineup for this Indianapolis Colt team, he's gone out there and he's played great football, is Josh Downs. Obviously, if Anthony Richardson returns, he's not going to have a lot of value where they just run the football a whole lot. And obviously, we know Anthony Richardson's a running quarterback. So week 4 versus Pittsburgh, where Flacco came in early in that one, for Richardson, 8 catches, 82 yards, a touchdown, 9 targets. Week 5 at the Jaguars, 9 catches, 69 yards, 12 targets. And week 6 at Tennessee, 7 catches, 66 yards, a touchdown, 9 targets. The proof is there with Joe Flacco in the lineup. He's going to keep targeting Josh Downs early and often. And we've seen Downs now in 3 weeks with Flacco in the lineup, a whopping 30 targets in those ball games. So Downs, he could run the routes. Speedy wide receiver. Him and Flacco have a great rapport. And obviously, this all depends if Joe Flacco's staying in the lineup. If not, he's going to lose value. But right now, like I said, Josh Downs out there in 52% of fantasy leagues. And the last chance for owners to get him this week, the next receiver, Christian Watson of the Green Bay Packers. We saw Jaden Reed. He got banged up in this ball game. He left but returned. And also, Dontayvion Wicks got hurt and he didn't return in this one. Christian Watson, we know he's a deep ball threat, one of the quicker wide receivers in all pro football, but injuries have been a problem and plagued him over the last couple seasons for Christian Watson. Before he got hurt versus Minnesota, only 1 target. Week 5 he missed, and surprisingly he did come back in week 6 off a high ankle sprain, only missing 1 game, 3 catches, 68 yards and a touchdown. So like I said, if Reed's not 100% and Wicks is going to be out, Watson steps right into a nice role, and he's got a decent matchup coming up this week versus the Houston Texans, where their secondary is definitely leaky. The next wide receiver is his teammates, Romeo Doubs of the Green Bay Packers. So Doubs, he was suspended a game by the Packers, where he wasn't showing up to practice or whatever the case may be, but he showed up with a nice ball game in last week's ball game. Is Romeo Doubs, 3 catches, 49 yards, and 2 touchdowns on 4 targets. So the same thing goes for him as well. Reed banged up. We don't know how serious it is, even though he returned in the game. And Wicks got hurt early in the game and didn't return. So Romeo Doubs, we know he's a talented wide receiver. We've seen flashes on and off, but week 6 definitely his best game of the season with 19.90 fantasy points in PPR league. So this week a good matchup versus the Houston Texans. Like I said, their secondary isn't all that great. Romeo Doubs definitely has a chip on his shoulder now, I believe, after getting suspended for a game from this Green Bay Packer team. And this week, definitely a wide out to head off the wire. Next receiver I looked at off the wire is Juju Smith-Schuster of the Kansas City Chiefs, and that looks like he might be the number 1 wide receiver over there for this Kansas City Chiefs team. Obviously, with Rashee Rice out for the season, Hollywood Brown, he's been out the whole year and is going to be out the whole season. And Smith-Schuster, with his first opportunity to get expanded snaps in week 5 versus New Orleans, he had a monster game, 7 catches, 130 yards on 8 targets. So Juju, obviously very familiar with this offense, and Patrick Mahomes a few years ago helping them win a Super Bowl for this Kansas City Chiefs team. And right now, coming off the bye week, refreshed even more and more into the playbook, I think Juju Smith-Schuster could help fantasy owners in a big way. I know the New England Patriots thought he was washed and his best years were behind him, but with the direction New England was going, wasn't going to fit the team, I believe, was Juju Smith-Schuster. So now back with Kansas City, now getting an expanded role. Once again, I believe he can help fantasy owners. Obviously, playing with Patrick Mahomes as his quarterback and knowing the system and getting time to get his legs under him and heal from some of his injuries. Right now available in tons of leagues at 69%. The next wide receiver I look to get off the wire, Xavier Legette of the Carolina Panthers. I mentioned Legette a couple times over the last couple weeks. Last week, Legette, he got banged up with the shoulder, but he played in this week's game. 3 catches, 23 yards, and a touchdown. In week 7, a good matchup with the Commanders. So the last 2 out of 3 games where his role's been expanded, where Adam Thielen's been out, Legette's found the end zone twice in that time. We know he's a first-round pick by this Carolina Panther team, and obviously this Panther team, 1-5 on the season, and they're just going to play the young guys and see what these young guys have. So like I said, Xavier Legette, good route runner, big threat, first-round pick by this Carolina Panther team, and a good matchup with the Commanders coming up. They give up the 7th most fantasy points to receivers on the season. Next receiver, Gabe Davis of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Gabe Davis, his best game as a Jacksonville Jaguar, but he's still a wide receiver. I believe he's very inconsistent. We've seen it, obviously, the last couple of years with Buffalo and this season so far with this Jaguar team, but it was his best game of the season, so that's why I have him on the list Week 6 to Chicago, 5 catches, 45 yards over there in London and 2 touchdowns. And now Week 7, a good matchup versus the Patriots in London once again, where we know this Patriot defense can't stop anyone. We just saw the Houston Texans score 41 points in that one versus the Patriots. And Gabe Davis, we know he's had big-time upside throughout his career, but never really reached his potential after that AFC Championship game a few years ago, where he had 4 touchdowns in that one. So Gabe Davis available right now in 83% of fantasy leagues. Receiver Rashad Bateman of the Baltimore Ravens. Bateman, he's been pretty decent over the last few weeks for this Baltimore Raven team, becoming a third option in this passing game for Baltimore. So on the season, he's got 3 out of 6 games, double-digit fantasy games. In the last 3 games for Bateman, Week 4 versus the Bills, 1 catch, 23 yards. Week 5 at the Bengals, 4 catches, 58 yards, a touchdown, 8 targets. In Week 6 versus the Commanders, 4 catches, 71 yards. So Bateman, we know he's got a lot of speed. We know he was a highly touted pick a couple of years ago. It just didn't work out with injuries and not producing. But now, with no pressure on him in this offense, he's going out there making plays, and he's become a nice back-end bench or bye-weekend filler at the wide receiver position is Bateman. Right now, he's available in tons of fantasy leagues at 89%. Like I said, in a high-powered offense, third, fourth option, worst case for this Baltimore Raven team. And with all the bye weeks, and if you're in leagues with more positions, you got to start players, or just in those deep 14-team leagues or deeper, I think he helped fantasy owners this week. Sid's Demario Douglas of the New England Patriots. So Drake May, he at least moved the football. I know some of it was garbage time, but players are going out there making plays, and they're definitely players to talk about. Demario Douglas, one of them, 6 catches, 92 yards, and a touchdown in last week's ball game versus the Houston Texans. So Douglas, 2 games in a row with double digits, and 3 out of 4 games with double-digit fantasy points. We know he's a speedy wide receiver. He's most likely the number 1 receiver as well on this team, where I don't think Jalen Polk's really number 1, or Bode, who we saw in that game, find the end zone as well for this Patriot team. So Douglas, like I said, 3 out of 4 games, double digits, and someone has to catch the football over there in New England. At least Drake May could stretch the field more than the Jacoby Brissett. So this week with a good matchup coming up in London and Jacksonville, gives up the most fantasy points to receivers on the season. Demario Douglas, definitely a pickup off the wire. In 93% of leagues, he's out there. And the final receiver I look to get off the wire this week, Devon Vele of the Denver Broncos. Vele, a young wide receiver, rookie season. We saw a game early in the year, and then he's been banged up ever since then. Was Vele, but now he's returned in Week 6. So Week 1 at Seattle, he had 8 catches, 39 yards on 8 targets. And then fast forward here to Week 6, 4 catches, 78 yards on 6 targets. So he's got speed as Vele. He could work in the slot, could work on the outside. Big physical wide receiver, 6'6", 6'7". And like I said, Week 1, he went out there and had a good game. And then the last few weeks, he was just banged up, and he didn't play in the ball game. So we know this Denver Bronco team, they need another wide receiver to step up next to Cortland Sutton in the lineup, and Vele definitely could be that wide out for this Bronco team. Need someone in a deeper league who can help you, and you possibly could catch lightning in the bottle. Vele's out there in 99% of fantasy leagues. That's a few wide receivers I looked at off the wire for Week 7 of the fantasy football season.